So now we're going to go over the actual practical assignment here for the macro photography and the lighting. So as you can see, it says that all photographs that are listed will be repeated using the following lighting conditions. So the first series is with no flash, the second is with the external flash, and the third is with the diffuser using an external flash or some other auxiliary lighting source, such as a flashlight. Remember, as we discussed earlier, we do not want you using the on-camera flash. That has to be defeated for the entire exercise. It says here as well, a note that the diffuser can be a white plastic box, as we described with the waste paper basket. You must use a scale associated with each fingerprint that is being referenced in the photograph. And these will be supplied to you either in lab or they will be sent to you remotely. So obviously other than your student ID card being your first photo, you will require a scale to be in there as well. Now, if you remember as well from the lecture that the scale positioning to maintain proper limitations of acceptable focus needs to be on the same plane as whatever your primary subject is. So if it's a fingerprint, it needs to be on the same plane as the fingerprint. It defeats the purpose if it's on a different height differential. Okay, so let's look at the actual assignment here. So the first photo being your student ID card. The second one is a photo of a coin. Whatever if you're remote, whatever your local currency is, just a coin of some sort. The third photograph here is going to be a photo of a watch face. So I have an example here. For this particular photo, we want the watch crystal or the glass on the photo to be intact when you're using it. So make sure that whatever watch you're using is fully functional with a glass or a crystal attached to it. This particular photograph, there is no fingerprint that's required to be on the actual surface. We're looking for how well you can photograph this macro image and be able to show the detail on the actual watch face itself, even with the impedance of reflected light coming through the crystal. So that's the purpose of this. A scale, as we discussed, is required for this. Now I should mention as well, for all of the photos that you're doing in this particular section, as with any photo that you're doing of fingerprints, you want to be able to fill as much of the frame as possible. So when you're deciding on trying to establish the best possible composition for the photograph, take into consideration the physical shape or dimension of the subject. So you want to either use a portrait or a landscape type of design to maximize the composition of the image. And what I mean by that is that, for instance, here we have a fingerprint on this can. So if you are using your camera in a landscape type of format, then turn the can so that now you're taking advantage of that landscape design. And likewise, if you're using it in a vertical format such as this, maybe switch it to a portrait design so that now you're taking advantage and filling the frame as much as possible with the image and on that particular mode. When it comes to the application of or inclusion of the scale, it's not necessary that the entire scale be visible within the image. As long as any pertinent information related to that, such as your R number and location and date and so forth, is visible. But suffice to say that only the hash marks or the graduation marks of the scale need to be included. You don't need the entire scale because, again, now you're wasting valuable or unnecessary space on that composition of the frame. So continuing on, so our next our next part of the assignment is number 4 here. So photographing a white fingerprint on a dark, flat surface. Now, I believe we are going to be providing you with copies of these backing cards. So if you have fingerprints that are developed with white powder on this surface, this would be acceptable for that portion of the assignment. Even still, you can see that there is a bit of a sheen on this, but for all intents and purposes, it is considered to be a dark, flat surface. The next one is fingerprint on a curved surface being a bottle or a can. So go back to this example that we gave before of this fingerprint that is on the vertical plane of this Fanta can. Now, one thing to be considered of, and we talked about this briefly before, is the location of the scale. Now, this is an example of borderline improper location of the scale. Now, the curvature of this can, as you can see, is fairly mild because the circumference is fairly substantial. The smaller the circumference, then the more effect of an impact that the scale location is going to have. If this was a much smaller diameter, for instance, even using a pencil, then the scale location should be, instead of being in this locale, maybe having it across here, so then it is definitely on the same plane as the print. Again, not so consequential when there's more of a mild curvature to the object. Number 6 here is using a knife. So the purpose of this is to develop fingerprints, probably using a powder other than using a magnetic powder, because obviously the magnetic powder is going to magnetize the surface and could cause interference with the development process. So maybe use one of your granular powders instead. Here we've got a fairly shiny blade surface that is going to have a reflective property to it that is going to potentially impact on the capability of photographing it or obtaining a good photo. So take that into consideration as well, the reflective nature of the surface. Now, this particular knife here, it has a fairly substantial handle to it, and this brings to mind photographing anything that is of texture in its design. So if you're photographing and using light angularly coming in from this side here, if it's grazed lighting, it's probably not a problem for illuminating that. If you're going to do it at less of a tight angle and have the location of the hot spot before the print and then just allowing the extra light to kind of cascade across, then that's probably the best option, or grazing it straight across. Now, I'm sure you can appreciate if you have a much textured surface and that light is being acutely grazed across the surface, that light is now going to impact and be accentuated more from the highs and lows of that textured surface. So it's going to be creating more of a shadowing effect in the furrow or in the lower recessed areas of that surface. So to compensate for that, if you did have that, and I use this as an example, if you were photographing this knife and coming in on a grazed angle over the knife blade, you may actually be casting a shadow or increasing a shadow on the blade of the knife. So in this case here, if you increase your angle of incident light, then now it's going to mitigate any issues that may arise with the varying textures of the surface. So just bear that in mind when you're photographing any textured surface. Number 7 is a photograph of the underside of a CD. I'm hopeful that people remember, either in a history book or whatever, what a CD actually looks like. But the purpose of this is to work through issues with the reflectance. So I'll just kind of tilt this so you can see the variance, the effect of that rainbow effect and the reflected light, which again is going to be problematic when you're trying to photograph it. some issues, whether it be the angle of light, whether it be the shadowing effect, whether it be trying to photograph something at a 90-degree angle, sometimes you just simply can't compensate or eliminate all issues. And this is one of those issues that you may not necessarily be able to eliminate all of that reflected light coming off of there that is impacting on the clarity or the visibility of the print, but the idea is to try to do the best that you can with it. Okay, so the final instruction here for the assignment, number 8 being a photograph of a spent cartridge case using the Tektron tool, which is the articulating assembly that we've shown in some of the other photos, with no flash. Now what we are suggesting for this, because obviously students that are remote are not going to have the ability to use the Tektron system, is to improvise. So first off, let's just look at the Tektron system and fingerprint on a cartridge case. So the purpose of this is to simulate an actual crime scene fingerprint on a spent cartridge case and how to mitigate that. So in this case here, we put the cartridge case that has a developed fingerprint. We put it inside the alligator clip of the Tektron assembly here, and it has a scale in place on there as well. You can see, because of the tight nature of the actual circumference of it, that the scale is now going the opposite direction. It's kind of hanging out over either side of the actual cartridge case, but the focus is going to be on the area that is actually in contact with the cartridge on that same plane. The purpose of this and the alternative that we're going to suggest is that you have a fingerprint on a very small or tight cylindrical shape. You have the reflective property of the cartridge case as being problematic as well, and using these alternate tools to support it while you're trying to photograph it. Now, in previous discussions, we have talked about potentially using a wider aperture to decrease the amount of acceptable focus, or to decrease your depth of field. In a case such as this, where you have defined fine detail on various planes of that surface as it goes around the curvature of the cylinder, I would suggest that you go to a smaller aperture so that you are increasing the depth of field, so that not only directly on the plane, but somewhat going around the corner is also going to be an acceptable focus. So there's an example using a cartridge case with the Tektron system, which is fine for students that are in the lab, but for those remotely, we're suggesting something else. And I've just created this. You can improvise however you want. I've simply taken a piece of Play-Doh, and you can use plasticine or any other soft, pliable material to set a small circumference cylinder in there. In this case, we're just using an HB style pencil. It has the shininess, the reflective nature being that shiny paint that's on there, and you can see I developed the fingerprint on this particular surface using black magnetic powder, and the scale is in location there on the same plane. Same effective purpose of the Tektron system, but just improvising.